starts out getting educated in England. He's a dissenter, so he can't get ahead there. There's a lot of political factions and stuff going on. Comes to America, finishes up his education at Harvard, gets a chance at a church that's basically out in the wilderness. It's not a great career move, but he takes that one and he stays there pretty much for the rest of his life. He's the patriarch of the village. I mean, he's the only really educated man there. And so he serves as the psychiatrist for everybody, naturally, since he was the minister. He also was the doctor. He was the judge. Informally, he settled disputes between people. We don't know an awful lot about him. He did do a journal, but I don't think it lasted. I think it disappeared. And so most of what we know is from the poems and from a few letters. The poems were never supposed to be published. He wanted them, he did leave them for the family, but he left them with specific instructions that they would never be published. He had written the poems, again, as a way of organizing his thoughts. These are largely a 3-hour or more communion sermon for the next day. Now, it wasn't that they had point-by-point references to every point he was going to make in his sermon, but that they gave the general tone that he wanted to have for the sermon. Now, as far as we know, unlike Donne, he never worked any of his poetry into his sermons, and he never read any of it in his church, and probably, I don't think there were even any of his parishioners who knew that he even wrote poetry. The poetry is completely private. It's between him and God. And for a metaphysical poet, that's probably the one thing that makes him maybe the equivalent of John Donne. We wouldn't even know about Taylor except that in the 20s, the president of Yale retires and leaves the manuscript for the Rare Book Collection. And a graduate student found it. Now, at the time, it's after the First World War, and you have what's called the Lost Generation. Young people who grew up mostly before the war with a whole lot of ideals. They went off to fight this war thinking it was the war to end all wars, that it was the war to save democracy, that it was the war against the beasts, the Boche, to save civilization. And they thought it was a big football game, and it wasn't. It turned out to be the most horrible nightmare they could have imagined. There was little opportunity for personal heroism. The weaponry had developed so quickly and so fast that the tank comes in that war. The first airplanes, the first dropping of bombs from the airplanes, poison gas, the machine gun set up crossing fire, and it was a war between trenches, and they got up and ran out of the trenches and got mowed down. Sometimes 80-90% casualties in a charge. More of them died from standing around in water in these trenches and having their feet rot out, having their teeth fall out, and getting pyorrhea and things, than died from wounds, and also from poisoned beef. So they came back having lost all of their ideals. And the ones that had been in the war and came back to America left again. They said, America doesn't have a culture. America has a marketplace. And Americans had always felt kind of inferior about their culture anyway. But from about the 1840s, when Emerson starts beating the drum for an American literature, we get a lot more confidence in it, and it does look like we do have one. But the expatriates who left the country, went to England, went to France, where they could live cheaply and be with other artists, they didn't believe that there was an American culture. However, a lot of American artists stayed behind, and they said, we do have a culture, and not only do we have a literary culture, but we have a rich tradition. And they pointed to some of the greatest novelists of all time, Melville and Hawthorne, Dickinson and Whitman. You can put them up against anybody. The one thing that Poe, the founder of the short story, I mean, we'd even had a literary genre that we invented. But the one thing that we didn't have was a metaphysical poet. We had some neoclassicists, but we didn't have a metaphysical poet. So it's kind of like not having the complete set We didn't have an actual culture, we didn't have one of everything. And when that graduate student read Who in This Bowling Alley Bowled the Sun, probably a great cry went up from the basement to the Yale Library, because he knew this is the metaphysical conceit. The more he read of Taylor, the more he said, this is somebody that's comparable to Donne. Now we got a full set. We got a metaphysical poet as well. And the reason that he is so good is largely because he doesn't have to care about any kind of an audience. He knows what he means. God knows what he means. They're the only two who are ever going to see the poem. Why spend so much time writing these poems if nobody's ever going to see them? Between him and God. He's a Puritan. Everything you do for God. And especially these poems, which are between him and God, have to be done with as much perfection as you can muster. And so he worked on them probably as hard as Anne Bradstreet worked on hers, but he never had to make any compromises. He didn't even have to pretend to like the neoclassicists, because it didn't matter what they said about him. They were never going to see them. And that frees him up in a way that few writers have ever been freed, because most writers want publication. One of the few others that got famous that didn't is Emily Dickinson. But for the most part, writers write so that other people will read it. And when they do, they start making compromises. And even if they get a first work done without a compromise, then the pressure to compromise is even greater, because you now have an audience that expects a certain kind of work from you. Well, maybe you're done doing that kind of work. You know, your blue period is over and you're going on to something else now. But your readers still want to read blue books. You have to write them, or you're going to lose your audience. So you have to start making these compromises. And Taylor doesn't have to make any of them. Also, I think he is free to reveal things about himself because he knows nobody will ever read these poems. And it took me a long time of reading Let by Rain before I think I may have figured out what he was really writing about, and that is that he was writing about himself. If you look at Let by Rain, and I mentioned this earlier, it doesn't go straight down the left-hand margin. It moves over, it comes back. It moves over, it comes back. This is a guy who is being enormously tempted.
Is being enormously what?
Tempted. And in fact, when we look at that temptation, now you remember the Puritans, and you remember what they thought of temptation. What do they think was usually the biggest temptation for people? Sex. And in fact, if you live in a culture where anything is forbidden, that thing becomes irresistible. And I think that's really what is happening with Edward Taylor. I think Edward Taylor well, who would be the worst person? Taylor is married. In fact, he had 13 children. So I don't think he was just having sex to make babies the way the Puritans are supposed to. I think he had a real interest in the subject. That being the case, what's the worst person for him to get involved with? A member of his own congregation. You can imagine him up there preaching his sermon, and there in the front row. Have you ever had that happen when you look at the person and boom, that's the one, that electricity passes between you? Well, it will happen sooner or later. Their eyes meet. It's what later on we'll see when we do the Fireside Poets, true love. One of the ideals of true love is that you know your true love when you meet them. Your eyes meet and you know it's them and they know it's you. And imagine Taylor had done that, and this is a parishioner. And this is way out of bounds. And underlying the poem, it's a rainy day. And I think that he was supposed to go and meet her somewhere. And it may be that they never consummated this, maybe. Because if this is the first meeting, if he goes, and one of the reasons why I think it's the first meeting is, if he had consummated this affair already, would he be so upset about should he go or shouldn't he? No, probably not. And then probably this is the first time he's ever even, in fact, he lived what he thought was an ordinary life, a minister's life. There's nothing real adventurous in it. There's no scandal in it. There's not really that much temptation in it. Everybody treats him like he's a special person, and so he acts that way. And all through his life, he's never been struck by thunder. So it's never really, he doesn't even imagine it can happen to him. If you're not a really passionate person, if you're kind of reserved and basically intellectual, as he seems to be, this is a guy cleverly playing with his mind when he's playing with these things, you probably would get the idea that it could never happen to you. And then it does happen to him. And now he's agreed to go and meet her. But he really doesn't want to go. Why not? What'll happen if he does? He'll lose his election. And then on the one hand is that great temptation, and on the other side is damnation. And it's raining, so he's got an excuse not to go. And probably they didn't say to each other, we'll meet somewhere in the woods and make love. They probably said, we'll meet and talk. Well, you go in the woods to talk with somebody and it ends up somewhere else. It's hard to say, ooh, that was a surprise. I didn't see that coming. He knows where this is going to lead, and he doesn't want to go, but on the other hand, he really wants to go. And he can't, when you want to do something and don't want it, you have that approach avoidance thing. What do you like? Do you sit calmly and weigh the two sides of this argument? No. You can't sit still. And he can't sit still. He's like the poem. He moves back and forth. Ye flippering soul, why dost between the nippers dwell? Not stay nor go, not yea nor yet control. Doth this do well? What's the matter with you? Get hold of yourself. You're like a hot coal held between the nippers of the pincers of a blacksmith. You're jumping all over the place. When you put something down, when you put the metal, like a screw or a bolt, in the fire to heat it down, it jumps around. And that's what he's like. He's like this piece of metal jumping around. Not stay. He hasn't said to himself, I'm not going. That's it. And he hasn't said to himself, well, a few hours in heaven, eternity in hell, sounds like a good deal to me. I'm out of here. He hasn't decided to go yet. And yet, not yay, not yes I'm going to do, or not control. You haven't rejected this idea, and you're not in control of yourself. Is this right? Why are you even doing this? You're a minister. How could you even get in this position where you're so tempted to go? And you know how wrong it is. Not yea, not yes, nor no. On tiptoes thus. Well, when you're on tiptoes, you're not really standing, but you can't walk. What happens when you try to walk on tiptoes? Generally, you fall over. It's kind of hard to stay up on them. And that's the way it is. He's balanced, but he's shaking back and forth. Why sit on thorns? What would happen if you sat on thorns? He'd bounce right back up. And that's what he's like. He sits down, he's right back up again. He's pacing back and forth around the room, the way the poem paces. Resolve the matter. Stay thyself or go. Be not both ways born. You can't have it both ways. You either got your election or you throw it away. But you can't have both. Wager thyself against thy surplus, see, and win thy coat. Or let thy coat win thee. Bet yourself against your profession as a minister. Either act like a minister and don't go and keep your election. Or let the fact that you're a minister keep you from going. And deserve to be a minister. Win thy coat. Or let thy coat win thee. Either deserve to be a minister and win the coat, or let the fact that you are a minister keep you from going. Let the coat win you. Is this the effect, the leaven, thus my spirits all? There's a couple puns here. What is spirit? Well, what's one meaning of spirit?
Liquor.
Alcohol. Spirits, and they're fermented. He's got this fermentation, but what's the other meaning of spirit? Ghost or soul. So it's like, is this the effect? Is this what happens when you're really in love? To be this stirred up? To make my heart a crabtree crask direct, a verjuice hall, as bottle ale whose spirits prison nurse when jogged the bung with violence doth burst forth? Says this what it's like? I'm like a crabtree cask, a cask that you would make cider in. And you ferment the cider. Sweet cider, you ferment it, it becomes hard cider. What happens if you let it keep fermenting?
It's going to explode, right?
Well, it will. It might eventually. If it doesn't explode, what will it turn into?
Vinegar.
Vinegar. That's what he means by a verjuiced hall. I'm like, right now, there's this fermentation in me. And if I take that fermentation out now, it will be alcohol. If I give in now, this will be, I'll give it to my passions, but my passions are at the peak. This will be as good as it can get. But if I don't give in and I resist the temptation, it'll turn sour in me. It'll become a vinegar inside myself. If I go and give in, I'll hate myself. But if I don't go and give in, I'll always hate myself for not going. I'm like a bottle of ale with a cork in it. And you shake it up, what happens?
Then they'll explode.
That's when it's going to explode. Pop the cork off. Basically, it's the old Elvis. I'm all shook up. And I'm going to pop my cork here. Feels like he's about to explode. He's been shaken up. And this thing has shaken him up because it's shaken his life. He's been living this life just the way he's supposed to. And he never thought he would ever run into this kind of temptation. Here it is. And he doesn't know. He's stunned by the fact. And there's a little bit of kind of awe in there that he's stunned that this could actually happen to an ordinary guy like him. Most people don't have a grand passion in their life at any time. And the more ordinary you see yourself as being, the less likely it is that you'll have something. I mean, imagine wanting somebody so much that you'd throw away everything you had. I mean, what's the odds on him being able to carry out this affair secretly?
Slim to none.
Yeah, slim to none. This is a Puritan community. They watch each other all the time. Yeah, maybe you might slip off to the woods this once, but you're not going to do that very often. The minister going to the woods, that's something everybody's going to notice. And they're going to start counting ahead and seeing who else is missing. So the odds on him getting away with this long term are next to zero. So and what happens if he gets caught having an affair with one of his parishioners?
Be shot.
Yeah, he'd be done. They would throw him out as a minister. Nobody would have anything to do with him. Not to mention the fact that he'll be damned for it. His job will be gone. His marriage will be gone. His whole life. I mean, this is a guy whose whole life has gone towards being a minister. And he's been a good one most of the time. And yet, he's tempted to throw all that away, knowing that it's going to be thrown away. And yet, he still wants to go. And there's a kind of amazement, it seems, in this, that could happen to him. He didn't think he was the kind of guy who would ever be that passionate about something. Shall I be made a sparkling wildfire shop? That's a great line. A blacksmith shop. But the blacksmith shop was the fire, and there's a lot of fire in there. And of course, he's also making a comparison to wildfire. If you've ever seen wildfire or brush fire, it moves incredibly fast. And of course, generally fire is associated with passion. And here's a grass fire gets out of hand like that. Well, what's that got to do with this situation?
That's how he's feeling.
That's how he's feeling. He's like this fire that's already burning and running away, and it's getting out of his control. There's that one brief minute, if you start a fire like that, when you can put it out. But 30 seconds later, it's too late. And he's right at that point now where if he acts now, he can stop it, but he's not really sure he can. Where my dull spirits at the fireball trade do frisk and hop, my dull spirits. Who ever thought I would end up like this? And the fireball trade, of course, is the blacksmith trade. And when you And while the hammer doth the anvil pay, the fireball matters, sparkles every way. The blacksmith heats up the metal. Then he puts it on the anvil and he hits it with a hammer. And everywhere he hits it, that red hot metal goes dark. But right next to it flares up and sparkles. And of course that's the way he is now. Every time he resists and stops that temptation, it flares up around his resistance. It gets even more sparkling and more attractive. And the more he resists, the more he doesn't want to resist. Of course, the more he thinks of not resisting, the more he thinks about how terrible it would be. One sorry fret, one little mistake, an anvil spark rose higher, and in thy temple falling, almost set the house on fire. Such fireballs dropping in the temple flame burn up the building. Lord forbid the same. The spark flew up. He's the minister, looks down at the congregation. The spark passes between him and her. Almost set the building on fire. He hasn't gone yet, but it's almost set it on fire. And what happens if he goes? What happens to the congregation if the minister is committing adultery?
It loses its faith in it.
It loses its faith in him, and a lot of them are going to say, good enough for him, it's good enough for us. And the whole congregation, it falls in the temple and the whole place will burn up. And that prayer, that's a really fervent prayer. Lord, forbid this thing. Don't let me go. Because not only will I destroy my life, but I'm going to destroy the life of a lot of people in this congregation. Now, we don't know whether he went or he didn't go. One poem that argues on the side that he did is Meditation 26. One of the most powerful poems that he writes. Unclean, unclean, my Lord, undone, all vile. Yea, all defiled. What shall thy servant do? Unfit for thee, unfit for holy soil. Not for communion of saints below. A bag of botches, lump of loathsomeness. Defiled by touch, by issue, leprous flesh.
He did it.
Is this a guy who feels good about himself? This is not a guy who feels good about himself. I mean, now before it's just his salvation, but now it's all that terrible guilt. Undone. His whole life is undone. He's thrown it all away. Unclean. He's so filthy, he doesn't even think that he should be allowed. He's defiled when you put dirt on something sacred. But what sacred things does he put dirt on? Yeah, himself, his ministry, his marriage, everything he believes in, everything. And it's all defiled now. Everything that he did that had been good and that everybody might have praised him for, he's thrown away, maybe in one act. I mean, we don't know how many times this happened. Maybe it doesn't even matter how many times. He's not fit to go into the church. He's not even fit for holy soil. Now, he's not Roman Catholic, but if you commit suicide, I don't think it's still true, but if you commit suicide, you can't be buried in holy ground. So what does that imply he's thinking about? Maybe killing himself. Remember, to the Puritans, thinking about it and doing it aren't all that different. I mean, here he's thrown away his life and he's thinking about killing himself. Well, that makes him a suicide. He's not even fit to be buried in church ground. He's not fit for communion of saints. How can a sinner like him hang out with the other Puritans, all of whom have got their election, and he's thrown his away? A bag of botches. Not one, that sort of implies more than once, though. Why?
A whole bag of them.
A whole bag of them. This isn't one mistake. This is a whole bag of botches. Lump of loathsomeness. I mean, a lump because it's solid. I mean, he's not just scum. He's a solid ball of scum that won't wash away. Defiled by touch. By her touch, by his touch. By issue, there's two meanings to issue. Issue means a flow of blood. Boy, there's a blood. This might be even worse than I thought it was. If he seduced his parishioner, that's pretty bad. But, well, who's it likely to be if it's one of his parishioners? One of the older married women?
No.
No. So if this was a virgin, I mean, at the time, remember how important virginity was. You couldn't get married as a woman if anybody knew that you weren't Virgo and Tacto. So that's a defiling of the innocent that any man would be guilty of. For a minister to be guilty, that's no wonder he feels so bad about himself. And the other meaning for issue, children. Boy, there's a nightmare. You have an affair with your parishioner and she's pregnant, which the odds are real good on those days. I mean, there's no birth control, and if it was a whole bag of botches, the odds against it have certainly gone up. Leprous flesh. Anybody know what a leper is?
Ones whose backwards.
Yeah, you rot while you're alive. So he feels like his body is just rotted. But also in the biblical sense, leprosy was thought to be a venereal disease. So the disease that he's caught is from sex. Now, that doesn't mean he actually got a venereal disease, but it means that the disease that he has, which is really a disease of the soul, is one that he got through sex. Thou wilt have all that enter thy fold pure, clean, and bright, whiter than the whitest snow, better refined than the most refined gold. I am not so, but foul. What shall I do? Shall the church doors be shut and shut me out? Shall not church fellowship my portion be? How can it be? Now he's really beginning to think about the consequences of his act. I mean, if his girlfriend's pregnant, they're getting to the bottom of that mystery, you can be sure. This isn't going to be the scarlet letter where she'll say she isn't going to give up who it was to Minister Dimsdale. It's definitely going to come home to roost, and he not only won't be a minister anymore, they won't even let him in the church. And he, all his life, has been being a member of the elect. And now it's gone, and he can hardly imagine that. Thy churches do require pure holiness. I am all filth. Alas, shall I defile them, tumble thus in mire? He's comparing himself here. A mire was a pig pen. And a pig pen wouldn't just have been mud. It means the pigs don't say, oh, okay, we're going to set this part aside as a bathroom. It's everywhere. This is a guy who's been climbing over a fence near a pig pen, and he fell in. And he's covered with mud and pig shit. Everywhere. And it's sticky. Now, if you've ever been around pigs, trust me, downwind from a pig pen, it makes the litter box seem like aftershave lotion. This has got to be some of the vilest stuff in the world. And it's all stuck to him. It's all, I mean, he's on his way. This is like one of those nightmares. You're on the way to somewhere important and something terrible happens to you. You're all sticky and you can't get clean. And he can't get clean. And he can't go into the church like that. I mean, he's the minister. He's got to show up. If he doesn't show up, people are going to wonder why. But it's because he feels so filthy. Shall I defile them, tumble dust and mire, or they me cleanse before I current pass? There's no worse sinner than me. How can I possibly go there? Is there some way that they can cleanse me? If thus they do, where is the nitre bright? And soap they offer me to wash me white. Well, if the church is going to clean me up, now he knows that it can't. But he's sort of arguing with himself here. All right, if they're going to clean me up, where's the soap they're going to do that with? The brisk red heifer's ashes, when calcined, mixed all in running water, is too weak to wash away my filth. They made soap out of fat from the animals, and they also made it out of, this goes all the way back to Roman times. When they didn't have any water around to clean themselves, they took an ash bath. They put the ashes all over themselves and then wiped the ashes all off, and that soaked up the sweat, and wasn't quite as good as a shower, but it was close. So he says, to get a bath of ashes that would clean me would have to be made from the brisk red heifer, the best animal sacrifice, the cow, the best of the cows. And I don't, why isn't it a red bull? Yeah, it's just the girl, maybe his wife is a sacrifice, because he's really already sacrificed her, and maybe the girlfriend, he's got to go in, maybe she's keeping her mouth shut. The only way to get out of this is to go in and admit to it, and if he's the first one, it's like, like watching Law and Order. First one that makes the deal with the prosecutor goes free, and the other one gets all the punishment. So if he goes in and confesses and she hasn't done that yet, she's in more trouble than him. Maybe she's the sacrifice he's talking about. Or it may simply be that he's so filthy, only the most sacred sacrifice could possibly make ashes good enough to wash him clean. Is too weak to wash away my filth. The dove is a sign, burnt offering, and sin offering ne'er do the feet, but as they emblemize the fountain spring, thy blood, my Lord, set out to wash off sin. They talked about being washed in the blood of the Lamb. That's what's going to wash him clean. Christ's sacrifice is what's going to wash him clean. Now here's a real, let me finish up this one poem. And then we'll go. Are thy rich veins thus tapped to ope this holy fount, boundless sea, for sinners to laver off, all sapped with sins, their sin and sinfulness away? The sinners are sapped with sin. Have you ever touched tree sap? You know how sticky it is, and you can't, alcohol doesn't even get it off. And he's like that. He's so sapped with sin, and he compares Christ to a shower. Christ's blood is pouring out all of his wounds. And they talked about bathing in it, but he's talking about washing yourself off in it. That's a metaphysical conceit, even for a Puritan. In this bright Christian crimson flows what washes whiter than the swan or rose, and that's Christ's forgiveness. Oh, wash me, Lord, in this choice fountain white, that I may enter and not sully, not dirty here, thy church, whose floor is paved with graces bright, and hold church fellowship with saints most clear. My voice all sweet there with their melodious lays shall make sweet music blossom with thy praise. Boy, if you can only save me from this, I'll never do it again. I'll be a good person after this, what I was before.
This time I mean it.
I don't know if there are any more. I really should look into the rest of Taylor's poems to see how many poems there are to tie in with that in the long run. All right, we'll finish Taylor next week. There's only a poem or two to do, and then we'll start on rationalism, romanticism, and Franklin. And we have the Franklin-Edwards test, right?
Yes.
That's why I read some of the other poems. First of all, you have the metaphysical conceits. And then you have the extended metaphors. The metaphysical conceits are carried out at length. In Huswifery, he compares preparing the soul to salvation to a series of things, all connected with making cloth. And the first thing he compares himself to is a spinning wheel. And he takes each part on the spinning wheel and compares it to some part of the process of conversion. Make me, O Lord, thy spinning wheel complete. Thy holy word my distaff make for me. Now, you've seen pictures of spinning wheels in the fairy tales and stuff. They had a stick that the loose threads were on, and that was the distaff. So he wants the distaff to be the Bible. Everything's based on that and flows off that. Make mine affections thy swift flyers neat. The flyers were the part of the spinning wheel which took the threads as they came in and twisted them together. So he wants his affection, his love for God, to take the word of God and blend them together and make a kind of a thread, the thread of his life out of it. And make my soul thy holy spool to be. The thread is then taken up on a spool, and that's what he wants his soul to take up God's word the same way. Make my conversation make to be thy reel, and reel the yarn thereon spun of thy wheel. Then the finished thread would be taken off onto a reel. So after those things are brought together, they would give him that the Christianity which would also draw other people into him, his talk and his behavior. Then he goes from the spinning of the thread to weaving in the second stanza. Make me thy loom then, knit therein this twine, and make thy Holy Spirit, Lord, wind quills. The loom would have been set out on a frame, and it would have strings that are attached top and bottom, come down like this. Then they would have probably a feather that the loose thread would be attached to. And that would be wound over and under the vertical strings all the way across, and then come back in the other direction. And then there was a little stick that you would push it up with to tighten it up. So when it talks about winding quills, it's winding the quill through this, through the cloth. And so God's Holy Spirit should be like the thread that ties everything together. Then weave the web thyself. The yarn is fine. Thine ordinances make my fulling mills. The fulling mills is where they cleaned the wool before they turned it into thread to weave it. So the 10 Commandments are what would make his life pure, like the fulling mills do the wool. Then dye the same in heavenly colors choice, and pinked with varnished flowers of paradise. So now he's gone from weaving the cloth to turning it into a coat, and then dyeing the coat, and finally embroidering little flowers and decorations on it. They talked often about holy robes for glory, that when the elect went on to paradise, they'd be given special robes. But the robe that he's also talking about here is his faith and his life. Then clothe therewith with all of this doctrine and with his commitment to the religion. And he lists all of the things about him that he wants Christianity to influence. Mine understanding, will, affections, judgments, conscience, memory, my words and actions, that their shine may fill my ways with glory, and thee glorify. Then my apparel shall display before ye, that I am clothed in holy robes for glory. If Puritanism influences all of those things about him, his life will be an example to everybody else, and he'll deserve his election. You notice how much more intellectual this one is than the other poems that we looked at earlier. This is a guy playing with his mind, which is what the metaphysicals do. And of course, he loves making those extended metaphors. We look at Meditation 8. He looks up at there's this chain of associations that links everything together. He starts out looking up at the sky. The bright battlement is the Milky Way. He sees that line of stars, and they make him think of a golden line between heaven and earth, what connects the two. Then he starts he makes a comparison to two metaphysical conceits. The soul, which is the bird of paradise, put in this wicker cage, my corpse, to tweedle praise. God's work is to glorify man. The soul is put inside the body. Comparing the body to a wicker cage is a metaphysical conceit. Had pecked the fruit forbade, and so did fling away its food, and lost its golden day. So we're like a bird that you put the seeds out for, and in the process of pecking at some of them, it scatters all the rest. And then it hasn't got any more to eat. Well, man threw away everything like the bird did when he got himself thrown out of paradise. And lost its golden days, and fell into celestial famine sore, and never could attain a morsel more. What filled man was the presence of God. Man's thrown that away. And so he goes around hungry all the time now. And no matter where he goes, he can't find any of this sustenance for his spirit. And if thou knock at angels' doors, they show an empty barrel. They no soul bread have. So even the angels can't help him. But God, seeing man starving for his affections, instead delivers, according to this theology, his son to pay it all off. And Christ is referred to by the Puritans, I think by other Christians, as the bread of life. Comparing Christ to bread isn't a metaphysical conceit. But when you can make this comparison, the purest wheat in heaven, his dear son, grinds up and kneads until his bread of life, which bread of life from heaven down came and stands this on thy table up by angel hands. So you compare Christ to bread, the bread of life. Make that metaphor, that's not metaphysical. But when you start talking about kneading Christ, like you would knead dough and rolling them out, now you've taken it a step beyond what anybody else would. That's always the key with the metaphysical. Wherever anybody's thinking would go, metaphysical thinking always makes a left turn and goes 2 steps further. And the same with this. And then, of course, when he compares this bread of life to eat thy fill, it's heaven's sugar cake. Sugar cake is a Twinkie. Comparing Christ to a Twinkie, that's certainly a metaphysical conceit. You notice everything in the whole poem is about baking imagery. The same thing when he does Meditation 38. Oh, what a thing is man. And again, he starts out with a question, and the question isn't rhetorical. He wants to know, oh, what a thing is man, Lord. Who am I, that thou should give him law, oh, golden line, to regulate his thoughts, word, life thereby. What is man that God should bother giving him a set of rules to follow? Why is he even worth it? And Taylor's not sure. And judge him too well thereby in thy time. You notice this chain of associations? God gave man rules. Well, the fact that they're rules means you're going to be judged by the rules. Then the judging leads him into this idea of justice. A court of justice thou in heavens hold, to try his case while he's housed here on mold. So in other words, according to Taylor, we're being tried every day for what we do and don't do. And this case is going on in heaven. How do thine angels lay before thine eye my deeds, both black and white I daily do? How doth thy court, thou panelist there, them try? Okay, the angels report on your deeds, but he wants to know, how can this be done while we're still living? But flesh complains, what right for this? Let's know, for right or wrong, I can't appear unto it. Shall such a sentence pass on such a suit? God has got to be all just. Well, part of our idea of justice is that you have a right to meet your accuser. You have a right to be present at your trial. So he says, if God is holding this trial for me, how fair can that be? I'm being tried in absentia. I don't even get to plead my own case. How can God be so unjust? But this is the flesh speaking. One of the common forms of a poem then was a dialogue between self and soul. The flesh makes arguments for life and the soul makes arguments for the hereafter. So this was the flesh making that argument, and the soul tells it to shut up. Soft, blemish not this golden bench or place. Here no bribe, no coloring to hide, no pettifogger to befog the case. This is God's court. You can't bribe God. You can't twist things around so they seem to say what they don't. A pettifogger is a lawyer who makes continual objections of minor things to stretch the case out so it gets so boring the jury just wants to get out of there and he thinks we'll acquit his client. So there's no lawyer tricks in God's court. Here, everything is judged according to the law. When he compares God to a judge, that's not a metaphysical conceit. Christ's attorney is, defense attorney, that's on the borderline of a metaphysical conceit. Because Christ is supposed to defend you against Adam's sin. But when he compares the Holy Ghost registrar is found, when the Holy Ghost becomes the court stenographer, that's a metaphysical conceit. You can also see that metaphysical kind of thinking in the next line. Angels, the sergeants are. Normally people think of angels, they think of guardian angels that help you out. But Taylor looks at it a way that most Christians don't remember to look at it, and that is, every time an angel shows up, except twice, somebody gets destroyed. Usually a whole lot of people. The flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, about the only time that whenever God has something being thrown out of the Garden of Eden, according to his theology, God doesn't throw Adam and Eve out. An angel comes with a fiery sword and drives them out. Whenever there's the angels are basically the enforcers of heaven. That's an unusual way to look at it. Normally they're seen as benevolent beings, but whenever they pop up in the Christian Bible, something gets wiped out. So if angels show up, you want to leave the area as quickly as possible. Nobody else would have thought of making them the sergeants at arms, the enforcers of the court. All creatures kiss the book and do as evidences abound. All cases pass according to pure law. Witnesses had it. Up until about 20 years ago, you had to put your hand on a Christian Bible and swear that you were going to tell the truth, which they finally figured out was pointless unless you were a Christian. So they finally got rid of that. But in Taylor's day, you had to kiss the book. And the idea was that if you were a liar, when you kissed the book, your lips would burst into flame. Nobody's ever did, but just the fact that they believed that would happen probably kept a lot of people from swearing falsely. Then he wants Christ as the advocate for his cause. He brings in legal terms like no habeas corpus against his clients came. For all their fines, his purse doth make down pay. That's that idea that Christ's sacrifice paid off everybody's sins. Their crimes, Adam's crimes, it doesn't matter. So he sides with Pelagius that everybody's born with their sins paid off. He non-suits Satan's suits or casts the same. Satan says, that's my soul. Christ says, no, I already paid for it, it's mine. Throws the case out. He'll plead sub forma pauperis for thee, even though he's a, what do you call that attorney that you get if you don't have any money? Public defender. Christ is the public defender. That's a metaphysical conceit. My case is bad, Lord. Be my advocate. My sin is red. What did red represent for the Puritans? Scarlet? Adultery. So that kind of ties in with those earlier poems. I'm under God's arrest. Thou hast the hint of pleading. Plead my state. Although it's bad, thy plea will make it best. If thou wilt plead my case before the king, I'll wagon loads of love and glory bring. Boy, this seems like another one of those, if you can just get me off on this one, charge kind of poems like the other. Again, we have an extended metaphor, a lot of metaphysical conceits, everything in it's about the trial. You can probably see all of the characteristics of a metaphysical poem in the preface. Like Anne Bradstreet's poem, it's the introduction to a larger work. But unlike Bradstreet's poem, it's not the introduction to an epic, but to a series of smaller poems. Now again, you might think it's kind of odd that a guy who never intends to be published would write an introduction to a book of poems. But that was the way it was done. Every book of poems he had seen, it had an introduction. If he writes one to God, it should have an introduction too. Should he shortchange God and not give it one? Now in the preface, there is a rational argument to what's going on. Like in his other poems, no matter how far afield they go, no matter how the chain of association seems to take them off in a lot of different directions, they all have that core of, we're guilty, God hates sinners, Christ gets us forgiveness, everybody's going to be forgiven. In this one, the internal structure is the book of Genesis. And it goes from the creation to the fall of man. But it doesn't go in any kind of straight line. Infinity, when all things it beheld in nothing, and of all nothing it did build. What does he mean by infinity? God. Infinity means endless. But endlessness didn't build things, God built things. So he's taking one characteristic of God, his infinity, and using it for the whole. And the reason he does that is, if he says God, everybody has a kind of visual image of what God's like. But he wants you to ponder about things. Remember, the metaphysicals want to make you stop and think. So when he puts infinity in there, and even if you immediately see that as a nickname for God, you start thinking about infinity. And infinity is endlessness. And we can say the word endlessness easily, but when you try to actually contemplate endlessness, it's impossible. We can't really hold that idea even in our mind. And you notice he introduces that first question that we looked at when we looked at Christianity as a whole, and that is predestination. Augustine had said, when God looked into the void, because he's all-knowing, he must know everything that ever happened. So the first thing that Taylor starts with is God looking into the void, seeing everything that would be, and then bringing it out and making the world out of it. But he has this chain of associations, and he does two things. One, every idea makes him think of a new idea. And when he makes a metaphor, when he makes a poetic comparison, he will then treat it as if it's real and ask a question about it as if it were really the case. For example, upon what base was fixed the lath wherein he turned this globe and wriggled it so trim? So it's called an implied metaphor if you don't actually state the two things you're comparing. What he's comparing is God and a woodworker. And the woodworker would take a block of wood and put it on a lathe and turn it and then shape it with sharpened chisels. So he says, now he's made that comparison. The metaphor is God is like a woodworker. Then he acts as if God really is a woodworker, and he wants to know, where did God set his lathe? Because he looked into the nothing. There was nothing there but the void. So what did he sit his lathe on? Then woodworking makes him think about metalworking. Who blew the bellows of his furnace vast, or held the mold wherein the world was cast? Now the metalworker would have had a long-handled crucible, kind of like a cup, that the metal would have been put in, and he would put that in the fire. When he did, his apprentice would work the bellows that looked like a folded umbrella that would blow air onto the hot coals and make them hotter. When the metal got molten, the apprentice would take long-handled tongs and hold the mold, and the master would pour the metal into the mold. Well, he wants to know, okay, if God's a metal worker, again, makes a metaphor, then he treats it as if it's real. If God's a metal worker, then who moved the bellows? Who was his apprentice? And if God poured the metal, then who held the mold? So again, he treats it as a real situation. It can't be both apprentice and master, so who was God's apprentice? Another one of those imponderable questions, which metaphysics like to send you off on. Then, metalworking makes him think about building things in general. Who laid its cornerstone? On whose command? Where stand the pillars upon which it stands? When you make a building, and they put the cornerstone in, who does the actual laying of the cornerstone? The masons, the workmen. Who gives the order for it? The architect or the boss. You can't be both the boss and the workers. So he wants to know, okay, when God made the world, who laid the cornerstone? If it wasn't him, who was it? And if he laid the cornerstone, then he must be a worker, so who was the boss that gave the command? The pillars, when they built buildings then, they didn't have steel girders and things. They didn't. Now we build down, and the steel girders go down into cement, and then we build up. What would happen if you just took a big stone building and built it on ordinary level ground?
Well, it would sink.
It would sink, and it wouldn't sink evenly, and it would break apart. So in order to prevent that, they were going to build a building. They would dig out a hole, the foundation, and put in stone pillars every so many feet. Then they would fill it back in with dirt. When they built the building, the pillars then spread the weight out so the building wouldn't sink and would stay level. So he wants to know, okay, if God's an architect and gave the command to lower the cornerstone, what did he put the pillars on? It's really the same question he asked earlier about the lathe. If God was there in the void, what did he set his tools on? What did he set anything on? Then he goes from men's work to women's work. Who laced and filleted the earth so fine with rivers like green ribbons smaragdine? First of all, what would a neoclassicist think of rhyming fine and smaragdine? Yeah, it's awful. What kind of poet is this? I mean, it isn't like fine is that hard to rhyme. Line, wine, mine, dine. There are all kind of real rhymes for that. To rhyme a one-syllable word with a four-syllable word, you got to be at extremes before you're looking for four-syllable rhyming words. So they would say this is a terrible poet. Metaphysicals would say smaragdine, what a great word. You really like the sound of it. It means emerald green. One of my students told me that it comes from the Danish for green. You know how the metaphysicals love words, and they just love the sound of words. I think Taylor had probably heard this word at some time in the past, and it was going over and over in his head, and finally went, "Ooh, I can put it in here." Because he'd been waiting all along to use that word. So he compares the earth to a dress, and God to a woman sewing ribbons and laces on it to beautify it. And the ribbons, of course, are like the rivers. Who made the sea its selvage? And the footnote tells us that selvage is the lace looping that would be done around the edges of a tablecloth. So again, it would be like a woman sewing lace borders on things. And if you look at the waves from high enough up, the white froth looks a lot like lace, and they don't all come in at once, so they're kind of scalloped. And it locks like a quilt ball within a silver box. Now our editor says that that quilt ball is a ball of yarn which has to be locked up in a silver box to keep it from unraveling. Does anybody knit? Kind of a dead art. Have you ever seen anybody who knits?
I tended
Did you have to keep your yarn in a silver box to keep it from unraveling?
to. No, it just unraveled, that's why I quit.
If anything, when you have the balls of yarn that you're going to use next, and you haven't started knitting with them, what do you do to keep them from unraveling?
I tied them together.
Tuck the end in. Yeah, that's all anybody needs to do. This isn't about yarn anyway. Quilts aren't made of yarn. What are quilts made out of? Patches of material. It hasn't got anything to do with yarn. The quilt ball that he's talking about is a pin cushion. They would have taken the extra squares of quilting material and fold them around and sewed them. And you would keep a pin cushion in a silver box for several reasons. If you lost a pin in those days, it could cost somebody their life. Remember, you go to the emergency room with any kind of a puncture wound at all, what's the first thing they ask you? Have you had your tetanus shot? That's how terrified we are of tetanus. Lockjaw. Any puncture wound could get it. Then, part of the tetanus life cycle, it goes through a horse, and it ends up in horse manure. I mean, there haven't been horses around 100 years, and yet this thing was such a killer. That was a terrible way to die. The resistance at the synapses all goes down. And so ordinary impulses that go down the nerve don't stop. They just keep firing. And so your muscles just knot right up until they break your bones. It was called lockjaw because your jaw muscles tightened up and they couldn't even pry your mouth open to give you any kind of water or anything. It was a terrible way to die. And any kind of puncture wound could lead to that. Now you step on a nail, you swear for a pin, and you swear 3 or 4 minutes and you pull it out. That's pretty much it. Maybe you go get a tetanus shot, although when the last case of tetanus in America was, I don't know. In any case, in those days, though, you stepped on a pin, that puncture wound could kill you. Plus, imagine that you have little children. You leave the pin cushion out, and you're a pin short. It's not like now where you can take them and get them x-rayed and CAT scan and we can know for sure, yes, there's a pin in there, no, there isn't. And if there is, we can do something about it. Then you have to wait until they either pass the pin or they don't. And if they don't, you never get relief from this word. Some of you are probably parents, so you know you spend your life terrified for your kids anyway. And imagine having to never know whether that baby swallowed that pin or not. Because the fact that it doesn't pass the pin in a day or two doesn't mean that it didn't swallow it. It may be lodged somewhere and then gradually work its way loose, and that'll be fatal. And you never know. So they're very careful with their pins, and you would lock them up so nobody could get at them. And of course, the third reason is that pins were hard to come by. Made goods in America were difficult, and a woman needed her pins to be like a guy losing his hammer. I mean, you can't build anything without that hammer, and you can't make the family's clothes if you lose your pins. So you would take extra care of that and put that in a silver box. And of course the quilt ball, the patchwork quilt of the fields. Looks like a patchwork quilt. Who spread its canopy? What kind of canopy is he talking about here? Remember, he just talked about quilts. If you had a room with a quilt in it, it might have what?
Okay.
The bed. The cloth roof on a bed. That's the canopy. And it would match the quilt. And the curtains would match the canopy, or curtains spun. Who in this bowling alley bowled the sun? You look at that and think, where in the world did that come from? You can see the chain of associations from the quilt to the canopy to the curtains, but how did the bowling ball get in here? Now, what they meant by bowling wasn't what we would call bowling. What we call bowling, they would have called 9 pins. What they called bowling would be closer to the modern game of bocce, where you have a long rectangular clay surface, and there's a small ball, and other balls are thrown from the far end to try to get close to that, and you knock other people's ball away and try to get closer. So he's really talking about what we would call bocce. And what must have happened was he's writing this in the bedroom, and he's looking around, and the quilt matches the canopy, that matches the curtains. Then he looks out the window. Now, his house would have been on the commons, the area that everybody held in the center of town, large grassy area. People sometimes brought their cows there to eat, and people camped there and stuff. But it also would have been where they played at bowls. And it might have been that he looked out the window, and there was the bowling alley, that flattened area. And when he looks up, the sun looks like a big ball being rolled down it. Or he sees them playing at bowls, which would have been done with kind of unpainted wooden balls about the size of croquet balls. And when he sees those wooden balls make him think of the sun. So the sun looks like a bowling ball. And then the sun seems to be rolling through, so it makes the whole universe a bowling alley. That is, though, the most famous metaphysical conceit in American literature. And the one where I think they really knew that they had a metaphysical poet when they saw that one. Again, you can see this chain of associations, though, that connects the ideas. Then we have that paradox I mentioned earlier, who made it always when it rises set, to go out both at once, both down, and up again. So how does the thing go set and come up at the same time? Goes down here, it comes up somewhere else. It's not really a contradiction. Who the curtain rods made for this tapestry? Who hung the twinkling lanterns in the sky? The lanterns in the sky are probably as neoclassical as he gets. Homer talked about the stars as twinkling lanterns. But you can see the metaphysical mind here. Even the Greeks had looked at the sky and seen it as a tapestry, a wall hanging with figures in it and pictures in it. But only a metaphysical wants to know who put up the curtain rods to hang it on. They always take their ideas one step further. Who? Who did this? Who is he? You notice if you look back up, look at all of those question marks. There's about 14 of them in 20 lines. 14 of them are questions. And again, they're open-ended questions, because that's what the metaphysical wants you to do. He wants you to ask questions. He wants you to think. He doesn't want to give you answers like the neoclassicist does. And then no matter how, the questions sort of seem to be getting an answer. The last one is the only rhetorical question I think he has, one where he actually gives you the answer. Who? Who what? Who did this? And then you might say God. Well, who is he? And then he tells you who. Why, no, it's only might almighty this did do. You know how you can see there an example of how they love to play with words. The Almighty was a term that the Puritans used for God, so he makes it might almighty. So you get that kind of a rhyme within the line. Then we have some puns. His hand hath made this noble work which stands, his glorious handiwork, not made by hands. Well, according to this theology, how did God make the world? By fiat, by command. Let there be light. Everything was commanded. He didn't shape everything up by hand. And that's what he tells you. Just in case you didn't get that little pun, he tells you in the next line, who spake all things from nothing. God called things out of the void. He didn't shake them up by hand. And with ease can speak all things to nothing if he please. What do the Puritans think is going to happen at any moment? Yeah. The end. The world's going to end. God's going to destroy it. So he can speak the world to nothing. Whose little finger displeasure can outmeet 10,000 worlds with half a span. God moves his little finger half its length, and he measures out 10,000 worlds. That might be hyperbole. On the other hand, who knows what the size of God's little finger is? 10,000 spans might not, 10,000 worlds might not be any distance at all for it. Whose might almighty, brought that one back in again, whose might almighty can by half a looks root up the rocks and rock the hills by the roots. Would a neoclassicist like that couplet, those last two lines? No, hate them. First of all, look at what he did. He rhymed looks and roots, which in New England would have been pronounced roots. So you have a terrible rhyme, and he cheated to do that because it's not by half a looks, it's by half a look. So he had to add an S onto it to make a terrible rhyme, and the second line's got way more beats than the first one had. So neoclassicals would say this guy's a terrible poet. He can't keep the meter, and he searches for these extravagant rhymes that nobody would ever think were rhymes if they didn't see them coming one after another in this poem. But look how clever he is. You can see how they like to play with words. He repeats two words twice in that second line. And he does each one as a noun and each one as a verb. Root, verb, up the rocks, noun, and rock, verb, the hills by the roots, noun. So root is a noun and a verb, and so is rock. So it's clever. That's what they're talking about when they talk about ingenuity. Something nobody would have thought of doing before, playing with the words. And so if it took an extra 10 beats to do that, metaphysicals would have said, hey, I'd have given him an extra line to do something that clever. Can take this mighty world up in his hand and shake it like a squitchin or a wand. The footnote says that a squitchin is a switch. What's a switch? It's a stick for beating children with. The Puritans, if you did something wrong, fathers did the beating. When they came home from work, the mother would tell them what they did, and then the father would say, go cut me a switch, which was supposed to be a long, flexible stick that they could whack you with. Now, if you brought back one that was so thin it wouldn't even hurt, they knew you weren't repentant, and they would get a switch, and then you would really get a beating. If you brought back a real big, thick one that they could only really hurt you, do you some physical damage with, they would know you weren't repentant either, and they would get a switch. What they wanted was one that was nice and flexible, so they could stand there saying, you know what you did, don't you? The beating doesn't start till you say yes, and then you tell them everything you did wrong, and they still stand there with that switch going, till you're thinking, you're starting to confess to stuff you didn't even think of doing. You just want to get the beating started. And of course, you're a little kid, so you don't know that they don't really know all of that stuff. You're sitting there thinking, how could he know about that? So then you start confessing to that. And of course, your father has no idea what it was that you did, but he'll get it all out of you sooner or later, just keeping that switch going. Now, it wasn't that the Puritans were big on child abuse. They thought they were chastising their children the same way God was going to chastise them as adults. And when you did something wrong, you got a punishment for it. He said what you did, you were sorry for it, and you took the punishment and were glad to get it, and that made you square again. That's the whole basis of Puritanism. So what they were doing by standing there was trying to do two things. One, it was to make that beating much more impressive, because the anticipation of anything is always more intense than the thing itself. And the second was the idea that if your father knows about those secret things you did, that God certainly knows. If you can't hide anything from the old man, you definitely can't hide anything from God. And that's what they wanted their children to grow up thinking, that you're not going to be able to hide anything. So you have to get those sins out. They were terrified, you remember, of secret sin, which we'll see when we come back to Hawthorne. Whose single frown will make the heavens shake like an aspen leaf, the wind makes quake. Now that, of course, has more of an image for them than us. An aspen leaf looks like the leaf on a Breyer's ice cream box. It's light colored on one side and dark on the other, and it moves easily in the wind. So it's always turning light and dark, light and dark. So when you see an aspen tree, it looks like it's shivering all the time. And the idea you should quake in God's presence because he hates sinners so much. Well, what a might, got might from might and almighty again back in this whose single frown doth shake the world as if it would shake it down. If God so much as scowls, there are earthquakes. Then he starts playing with that word nothing and uses it over and over. And it's just for cleverness sake. He's not really adding anything. For example, which all from nothing fed. God brought everything out of nothing, spoke everything out of the void. From nothing, all. Well, the second half of that sentence is exactly the same thing as the first, but he gets to use nothing twice. Which all on nothing set. There's your answer to all those questions. What did God set the lathe on? What did God set the pillars on? He set them on nothing. What did he set the world on? He set it on nothing. The success of creation depends on man's resistance of evil, which he has free will to do. And man is nothing. Man is worthless. At least the Puritans felt that way. So God's whole plan rests on man, and man is worthless. Lets nothing fall. Possibly a reference to the idea that not a sparrow falls, but God knows about it, or that he didn't let Adam and Eve fall. They didn't slip from his hand. They jumped. It was their free will that got them thrown out of Eden. Gave all to nothing, worthless man, indeed, whereby, though nothing, all man might him glorify. That's Augustine's argument. Man is worthless, but he glorifies God by taking part in God's plan. In nothing, then, embossed the brightest gem, more precious than all preciousness in them. In nothing, in man, he puts the soul, which is worth more than the body. But nothing, worthless man, did throw down all by sin, and darken that lightsome gem in him that now his brightest diamond is grown, darker by far than any coal pit stone. And the comparison that he's making there is between a diamond and between anthracite coal, not bituminous coal. Bituminous coal was in the South, Virginia in the South, and it's soft, chalky stuff. But the coal from New England and Pennsylvania is anthracite. It's hard. It's called black diamond. It's more brittle than diamond. It breaks apart more easily, but it looks like diamond. So man's diamond is filled up with sin and then looks like the coal. Now the association is probably that they're both made out of carbon. The science of Taylor's day did know that. I don't think they knew that if you subject coal to millions and millions of tons of pressure over millions of years, it becomes diamond. So I don't think he knew that. But he did have the connection with all being carbon. And again, it goes from the beginning, the making of the world, till the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. Anybody have any questions or comments on Edward Taylor? Okay, let me change the tape then so we